This was a selective leak, and it was done, I think, to deliberately try and downplay the success of the strike.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Wednesday, June 25th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and joining me are Real Clear Politics co-founder and president Tom Bevan and Washington bureau chief Carl Cannon. Well, it looks like a Democratic socialist will be the next Democratic nominee for mayor of New York City. Zohran Mamdani leads in the city primary right now. This is a ranked choice election, so it may take a few days to sort out the final numbers. But Andrew Cuomo, who was until recently the favorite, conceded last night. So here's a bit of Mamdani's election night speech, Tom.
We have won because New Yorkers have stood up for a city they can afford. A city where they can do more than just struggle. And it's where the mayor will use their power to reject Donald Trump's fascism, to stop mass ICE agents from deporting our neighbors, and to govern our city as a model for the Democratic Party.
Boy, lots of promises there. Tom, what's not to like?
Well, look, this guy clearly, I think, has captured the energy on the left. He's young, he's charismatic, he ran a pretty good campaign, social media focused, and he did it by promising a lot of goodies. We talked about this yesterday. I mean, he's promising a $30 minimum wage and free bus rides and, rent freezes and all sorts of things, right? City-run grocery stores to bring down price of groceries. So universal health care or child care, early child care. I mean, he's promised all these things. He hasn't explained one single way that he's going to pay for any of this stuff other than taxing the rich, which of course we know will drive more New Yorkers out of the city and put the city in what could be a downward spiral if it's not already in one. So look, it's a fascinating moment for the Democratic Party because they've been sort of flailing about, and yet here comes this guy, sort of rising star out of nowhere. And now you have, and we ran a couple of these pieces on the front page of Real Clear Politics. You've got, folks on the left saying, listen, Democrats, this is the future of the Democratic Party. They need to respond to it. The establishment got their ass kicked, right? They're out of touch. They're old. This is the new way. We got to, Democrats should embrace it and should harness it. And then there are other folks who say, look, this is a moment of truth for the Democratic Party. If you ever want to be a relevant party again, you got to stop embracing these far left candidates and this far left nonsense. And if they're able to do that somehow, they may be able to sort of reclaim the mantle as a party of sort of centrism, and which would put them in obviously a much better position for a national election in 2028. So it's going to be interesting to see how this works out. I mean, first of all, if he wins the general election, Carl keeps mentioning, I think, that, Eric Adams could have a shot, and maybe he does now. I mean, maybe Republicans, what few Republicans there are in New York City, will band together with some centrist Democrats and reelect him, or maybe Andrew Cuomo runs as an independent. But it's going to be a really interesting moment of truth for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, Carl, is there a danger though that we make too much of this? Because lots of first of all, it's a very blue city, a Democratic primary. Andrew Cuomo ran a pretty terrible campaign by all measures, and turned out to be highly unpopular. So, is there a possibility that maybe we shouldn't, this is a little sui generis, we shouldn't really draw too much of a conclusion based on this one race?
Yeah, maybe, Andy, you could be right in this. I didn't know anything about Mamdani before this began. Why would I? He was an obscure backbencher in the New York legislature, 33 years old. I think,
former rapper.
Yeah. And he's handsome guy, speaks well, and our politics are very much, personality driven. He's got charisma. I kind of get it. I get your point too, Andy, but you've got a succession of these mayors. New York City is saying to Chicago, hold my beer. Yeah, you got your nut, we got ours. But Mamdani doesn't come across quite like Brandon Johnson does, and he seems, he's a real populist appeal. The MAGA movement is populist on the right. This is populist on the left, and the normal suspects endorsed him: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders. He's only 33, and he seems too young for this job, really, and too unseasoned. But the alternative was Andrew Cuomo, who was well known, not well liked, and passed his sell-by date. He's
got the endorsements of Bill Clinton and all the sort of usual suspects from the old establishment.
But let's give David Hogg his due here. This guy is half Andrew Cuomo's age, and I looked it up, and I wrote in my column today when AOC beat Joe Crowley. She was 28. She was exactly half his age. This is a generational thing as well as much as anything else. I think as much as ideological. We've seen these polls for years that Gen Zers and the second half of the millennials, they don't like the Pledge of Allegiance. The American flag strikes them as a racist symbol. They prefer socialism to capitalism. What did we think was going to happen when they started voting for candidates who reflect these views? And in terms of, promising free government-run grocery stores, free child care.
Headlines.
Free, he didn't say subways. He said bus fare. The subway's a little more complicated. Tom said, except taxing the rich, we're going to get money. Well, also a corporate tax, upping the corporate tax. And what I'm curious about is whether some of these whether this will, because this excess has been happening. A couple of these, venerable New York corporations say, all right, we don't need it. We're going to Delaware. We're going to Florida. We're going to Texas. Even New Jersey is more hospitable now than New York, where, if they start leaving, then you're left with this conundrum on the left that since I was a young man, Democrats love jobs. They just don't like employers. They don't like the people who create jobs. Although AOC went one better when she didn't even want Amazon to move a plant into an adjoining district. She didn't even like jobs, let alone employers. And this is the conundrum. If they're going to be the party of working people, where are people going to work?
Can I add something real quick to your question, Andy? I don't think we're making too much of this, because it is how's the Democratic Party, if you've got Karen Bass running Los Angeles, Brandon Johnson running Chicago, Mamdani running New York City. These are the three largest cities in America. You've got is Muriel Bowser still running Washington D.C.?
She's a real moderate compared to those three.
Exactly. But so you've got these three sort of leftist radicals running these huge cities. And I can tell you by personal experience in Chicago, it's not going well. And we saw what's gone on in Los Angeles. How does the Democratic Party distance itself from that? How does it make a break? National candidates are just going to say, oh, well, that's we don't want any of that stuff. That's terrible. No, it's going to be hard for them to tell voters that they reject that, or they're not about that. They're more centrist. It makes it a much more difficult needle to thread for Democrats if they're, the three largest cities in America are being led by left-wing Democrats. I mean, it's going to be really, really hard.
Well, speaking of schisms in the Democratic Party, we did have articles of impeachment introduced yesterday in the House. Representative Al Green of Texas, over what he calls illegal and unconstitutional military strikes in Iran. Carl, measure failed in a 344 to 179 vote. 128 Democrats voted to table the resolution, but 79 supported it. Is this further evidence of that schism that Tom's talking about? And how do you put the two wings back together?
Well, it certainly is. You think 79, nearly 80 Democrats. Not a majority of the Democrats in the House supported it, but Axios did some reporting, and a lot of the mainstream Democrats were really angry about this. They thought it was irresponsible. And the last people saw of Al Green, and actually the first most Americans saw of Al Green when he was being escorted out of the House chamber by screaming like a madman, waving his cane at the president during the State of the Union address. And I always say this whenever I write about this. This is not the Al Green who was the singer. This is a different Al Green, because, Al Green, the singer, was very much a togetherness person. Anyway, they resented being asked to cast this vote. And this was the problem. his theatrics where he was escorted from the hall and later censured. Let's be serious for a minute. I'll assume he's 77 years old. I assume it was a sincere thing, that it wasn't just grandstanding. He really feels that way about Donald Trump. But this is different. This is now forcing your conference to take a vote on this. The vote was to table it. And a lot of these, 79 progressives, yeah, all the squad and all the normal people you'd expect voted for it, but not just them. Some progressives who are very, not grandstanding people, very principled, very liberal people. But you got to figure they're looking over their shoulder. Is somebody like AOC going to primary me if I don't, in my district, if I don't do this? And to Tom's point, this was a deliberate effort to push the Democratic Party left. And I think if you're a Democrat, it's gratifying that a clear majority of Democrats rejected that and said, that's not right. We didn't impeach Obama or Biden over these things. We're not going to impeach this guy over that. That's not an impeachable offense.
Yeah.
But it shows you the pressure in the party.
Yeah. Well, Tom, I think President Trump tweeted out, "Make my day." This is kind of good for him.
Of course, it's good for him. It's happened twice already, and he's only gotten stronger and gotten
Tom,
more.
if they impeach him a couple more times, he could probably get a third term.
Probably get. And this is what I don't understand. It's like it makes no sense politically to do this. I mean, have your rallies, have your filibusters, do all these things, but to file articles of impeachment over this, as Carl mentioned, I mean, this is something that, we can have a serious debate about the War Powers Act and when Congress needs to get involved and when it doesn't, when presidents are allowed to do airstrikes or not, because everybody has done it. Barack Obama did it. Joe Biden did it. I mean,
Bill Clinton did it.
I mean, it's sort of absurd on its face. And what do they think? Like the third time's going to be the charm? Like they're finally going to get him? I mean, it's like Wile E. Coyote, chasing the Roadrunner. It makes no sense. And
and to the merits of that issue, Tom alluded, Andy, and you have thoughts about this. You can make a principled argument that the War Powers Act itself is unconstitutional, not just ignoring the War Powers Act, but that Congress doesn't really have the constitutional ability to defer its war-making authority granted in the Constitution to the president the way it did with the War Powers Act. That was a compromise legislation. The Supreme Court ruled that the line item veto was unconstitutional. This was a case where Congress gave the president the authority over the budget. We can't control ourselves. Stop me before I kill again. The Supreme Court ruled that was unconstitutional. You can make a principled, small c conservative argument that this is Congress's power. The problem is that if you have one political party who's only interested in exercising that power, depending on the identity of the president and the White House, it makes the whole Democratic Party look cynical. Well, or the Republican Party if they were doing it. It's not a serious political proposition.
All right, well, guys, we're going to have to take a break now. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. Don't go away. We'll be back with more right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Carl and Tom. And Carl, CNN released this exclusive report based on what they called early U.S. intelligence, saying that, quote, the U.S. military strikes on 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities last weekend did not destroy the core components of the country's nuclear program and likely only set it back by months. President pushed back on this pretty hard, called it flat out wrong, blamed it on what the White House called an anonymous low-level loser in the intelligence community. What do you make of the report, and what do you make of the president's response?
Well, it was anonymous, all right, but it may not be low-level. It may, we've learned. Remember the 51 former intelligence officials, including several former CIA directors, who claimed that the Hunter Biden laptop had all the earmarks of Russian disinformation. This is that kind of reporting. It's selective leaks of classified information, that on its face is top secret. So it's probably a crime to leak it to CNN. Not that CNN did anything wrong. Reporters are held to a different standard, should be. But I wonder about the motivations of the leakers here. Is it to make Trump look bad? But on the other hand, you got to be skeptical in both directions. For for President Trump within minutes to pronounce this a complete success. It eradicated Iran's entire nuclear capability, and everything was perfect. And how did he know that? He was actually talking about that before he could have known, before the reports were in. So I take both. I don't think we know. I'm very skeptical of the motivations of the people who leaked it to CNN and of the report itself. But I'm equally skeptical of Trump's characterization of it. This is the kind of thing that in a less dysfunctional democracy, we would wait and see what we actually found.
Right. But Tom, I mean, it's a preliminary report. I mean, the CNN identified it as such. I think
it's not a report. It's not a report, Andy, so much. It's just people talking, right?
Well,
it's an initial assessment.
Initial assessment. I mean, I don't want to get semantic with
also known as guessing.
It
right.
It was certainly a legitimate story. It seemed to me, Tom, and I don't think they reported it in a irresponsible manner. That's my view.
Well, here's part of the problem. The same reporter who wrote that 51 intelligence officer story for Politico, Natasha Bertrand, is the same one who wrote this story. And, Carl can say, well, the reporters didn't do anything wrong. Well, the reporters, in my opinion, are, and Natasha Bertrand, are sort of complicit in this. They're leaking, in the first instance, leaked to try and help Joe Biden win that election, and lied to the American people about the authenticity of that laptop. And Natasha Bertrand was a willing participant in that. Here we go again. Immediately, it's almost predictable, right? The effort to leak stories that somehow downplay the success of, Donald Trump's efforts in Iran. Just as Carl said, I mean, obviously Trump's trying to play up his success. But again, it's one report. It's an initial report. And by the way, didn't mention the fact that there were other, conflicting reports about just how much the Israeli intelligence, by the way, released their own assessment, which said that had been set back 7 years plus. So, I mean, this was a selective leak, and it was done, I think, to deliberately try and downplay the success of the strike.
But what gave the story juice was the White House response, right? I mean, if this had come out and the White House had said, well, that's one report, or we didn't, that's early assessment or something, there's any way they could have downplayed. But why we're talking about it in part is because the White House jumped on this and jumped on CNN so strong that it became part of the story.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. It was a front page story before. But the other thing, Andy, if you're talking about the political fallout, is that Hakeem Jeffries, the Speaker in House in waiting, said this CNN report showed that President Trump had lied. I mean, it's just we're weaponizing things that in another era, Andy, when you and I were younger reporters, these were things that weren't used for partisan advantage. We would wait and see. The Democrats and Republicans will both be briefed. They might have a slightly different take on it. But in this era, everything is partisan. And so a person who just wants to know the truth, an American citizen, how much damage was done to Iran's nuclear facility, well, that depends what news broadcasts they listen to. That depends on what because that's the information they get. And I think that's the harm. That's the harm of what I'm talking about. And again, I don't fault the CNN reporter, and I didn't fault her with that letter because that she was right. That letter had been circulated by the intelligence community. That was accurate. The people I fault were the people who signed the letter.
Well, yeah, but Carl, I mean, there's a difference between being as a reporter being used by the institutions, right, to put out false information, misleading information. I mean, you can't just say oh, well, it's not the reporter's fault. They just reported what was given to them. It's like, well, okay, that just doesn't pass muster. I mean, you can't just report stuff if it's total lies and propaganda. I mean, that's not journalism.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue that. I take that point.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, as long as we're talking about reporting and stuff, Kari Lake gave this long-awaited testimony on Capitol Hill today about the future of Voice of America, or the non-future of Voice of America.
Was it really long-awaited, Andy? Were we on the edge of our seats for this?
There were some of us who
Andy and I care about this story, Tom.
Okay. I'm maybe in the category of less so. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
All right. Well, so her testimony was called Spies, Lies, and Mismanagement. For the most part, she criticized the agency for things that went back a couple of years, really didn't give a plan as to what she was do going forward, but did say that, and repeated a couple of times, that she thought that the whole place should be shut down. Carl, what do you think of that?
Well, you know what I think of that. I think Voice of America is a tool, and that Americans should use. I thought they actually had an excellent director, Mike Abramowitz, who's a long history defending human rights and is not considered a partisan person at all. But this was one of the agencies that President Trump, this first time he had trouble. He appointed Michael Pack, and Michael Pack was his to run the board. His nomination was held up for ethics reason by Bob Menendez. You can't make that up.
Right.
Menendez is now in prison. Michael Pack, all the charges.
Old Bar Bob is in prison.
Yeah, and the allegations against Michael Pack turned out to be, basically drummed up rumors, and there was nothing to it. So you understand why the Trump people came in with a chip on their shoulder. But there was a different Voice of America director. It was Mike Abramowitz. They decided to do this before they really looked at what was going on. And you and I have talked about this on the show, and you and I have talked about it privately. We think Voice of America has a role in the world. And we noticed that when Israel started attacking Iran, they had Voice of America put out a work for Farsi-speaking people who could broadcast, in the Persian language to the people there. It still has a role. Should it have been reformed? Yeah, sure. But let's get about the reforming instead of just, what they've done is told all the people stay home, and Voice of America sued, and other things in court. And I don't think this should be decided in the courts. I think it should be decided in a bipartisan way among policymakers.
Tom, we got about a minute here.
Yeah, look, I'm not as knowledgeable or passionate about VOA as you two are. And I know, Andy, you wrote about this for us recently. And so my attitude is, this was sort of like a consolation prize for Kari Lake. I mean, she's a two-time loser in Arizona. She lost the governor's race. Some people thought she might have won that Senate race, and was a Trump ally, and he needed to find a spot for her. And he gives her this, position, which I don't even know what she was a former, newscaster. So I guess she's got some background. It's not completely, out of left field.
Journalism for 30 years. Yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, she came in, and I guess her mandate was to shut it down and tear it apart, as opposed to doing what, Carl saying, look, let's not throw the entire baby out with the bathwater. Let's find some reforms. Let's keep the parts that are most crucial. But that doesn't seem like that's what's been done thus far. And so I don't know that it's been handled in the best possible way or by the best possible person.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, we're going to have to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. We'll be back with more right after these words.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, Real Clear Politics. Talking now with George Condon, frequent guest on our show, and the esteemed White House correspondent for National Journal. And George approaches that beat. I covered the White House for 15 years. George approaches it like I did, but only better. Which is to say, if you're covering the president of the United States, you're really covering the presidency, and you have to know what happened. You have to know what happened before. George does a good job of that. He especially does a good job of it in today in a piece about presidential swearing. Gee, George, what a topic! I wonder why you thought of this now at this time.
Just out of the blue, very blue.
Yeah, very blue. So, all right. So Trump dropped an F-bomb the other day on Israel and Iran. I previously on this podcast, I thought it was inappropriate, and not just the language, but in this context. First of all, I think there's a false equivalence between Iran and Israel. That's just my view. And the other thing is that, it seems that international diplomacy is when you need to be most careful with your language. But that aside, you were there. You were there when he said it. What was your reaction?
Well, you're talking to somebody with 12 years of Catholic education. Uh, I'm still angry that what he said was sitting next to the cardinal at the Al Smith dinner. So yeah, it's totally unpresidential. He once said in the campaign, "I can be more presidential than anyone." Well, in this case, he wasn't.
Let's go back and look at some. You do a good job in your piece. You didn't write about this much, but Jimmy Carter, when he was president, said, Ted Kennedy, he was asked at a congressional, I think it was around congressional Democrats. It was late at night dinner. I don't think there were cameras there, but he said, if Teddy runs against you, what do you do? And Jimmy Carter said, I'll whip his ass, which was controversial mainly because, Carter was this Baptist evangelical Christian. It seemed at odds with the public persona that they had created. It wasn't that bad a statement. But there's been other things. Tell us, tell our listeners and viewers some of the stuff you found when you went into your memory banks and your history books.
Well, the first thing that I learned is I wanted to see if any president didn't swear. And I have to admit, I was stunned to see who the one is who didn't swear.
But before you tell our listeners, and if you're listening to us on SiriusXM Radio, POTUS channel 124, or maybe watching on our podcast, just think for a minute. I'll give you a second to think. I'm stalling because George has an answer. You think of who these presidents would be we've had some very pious presidents, and you wouldn't think, George, I'm stalling as much as I can. You wouldn't think it would be a soldier, would you, George?
Oh, God, no. And a close friend of William Tecumseh Sherman, who was famous for swearing up, to the point where he shocked other soldiers. But Ulysses Grant never swore. Let me just read what he said. He said, "When a boy, I seemed to have an aversion to it, and when I became a man, I saw the folly of it. I have always noticed too that swearing helps to rouse a man's anger, and when a man flies into a passion, his adversary who keeps cool always gets the better of him."
Well, that's a dated view now, isn't it?
Well, but it's dated. But if you're a military officer and you're keeping your cool while your opponent is losing it, you're going to prevail.
So you got that. That's from Grant's memoir, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that edited by Mark Twain, which is a pretty good editor to have, isn't it? Let's think of a couple other examples. Well, when Joe Biden was president, he used a vice president, he used the F-bomb while trying to compliment Barack Obama, didn't he?
Right. Well, the difference is though, and this has happened many times where you've had hot mics that they didn't realize. That is plagued several modern presidents, and not a modern president, but Franklin Roosevelt in the wheelchair went into the voting booth in 1940, and it was a new machine, and he was having real problems, and he was cramped in the wheelchair, and people in the building heard him say "damn," and that was a major fuss. He had to deny that he said it, and ministers got involved. Times have changed a little.
Yeah, I remember, Jimmy Carter, and he wasn't president yet; he was governor. I think it was the interview with Playboy magazine.
Playboy, yes,
used the word "screw," and as a euphemism, but that's not a swear word. It's a kind of off color, but it's the replacement for the F word. But he got newspapers. Remember this some newspapers wouldn't even use the word, George.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I will say, I used words in my story last night that I have never in 50 years as a reporter used in any story that I wouldn't have been allowed to use. But if the president of the United States is using them, we're going to use them in our story.
Well, that's the issue. Now, you and I came up in the same day, and the phrase we would say in our newsroom was, this is a family newspaper, and the idea was that kids are going to read newspapers. Right. Now, most kids didn't read political stories; they read sports stories. But in the sports pages, if you'd ever quoted, I'm from California, if you'd ever quoted Tommy Lasorda, you would. So when did you ever overhear a president swear yourself, George? Between the two of us, you and I have covered the beat, 35, 40 years.
Well, there was the instance when George W. Bush talking with Dick Cheney at a campaign event, and again, you go back to the hot mic. The president did not intend for anyone to hear this. He was just sharing his opinion with his vice president, and he called a reporter from the New York Times, Adam Clymer, a major league asshole.
Yeah, Cheney agreed.
Cheney replied, "Big time." Uh, so
But
that
all right, but here's the thing that you and I know because we covered this campaign. Trump followers of Donald Trump, supporters of Trump who've been to these rallies would know this. The networks, MSNBC is a little loose with it, but the networks don't always care. But he's been working in blue for a couple of years now. I heard him at the California State Republican Convention in 2000. Yeah, 2000, well, what, 2 years ago now, right? A year and a half ago. And he used bad language there. I was a little surprised. He'd say, I don't give a shit and things like that. He'd occasionally use the F word. So he's been doing this. He's been working up to this moment, in other words, hasn't he?
right. Well, that's actually one of my criticisms of the president is that he does not have a sense of timing or place. Every event that he goes to, he sees as a rally. So he will go to West Point and give an inappropriately political speech. He'll go before troops and do that. He'll, as I said, go before a cardinal and swear. It's just, he doesn't say, okay, this is a freewheeling event and this is a presidential event.
You reminded me, I was once giving a speech, George, and it was one of these funny things that seemed like a setup. Remember Steve Rabinowitz, who was the head of advance for
Rabbi?
For Bill Clinton. We call his nickname was Rabbi for obvious reasons. Somebody from the audience asked me a question. Does Bill Clinton use swear words? And I said, well, yeah. I said, and yeah, and his wife does too. I mean, she swears like a longshoreman, but they do it in private. And the guy says, but I said, but I told him about Rabbi. I said, but there was a guy, and Clinton, and he has a sense of decorum when you can use his words and when you can't. To the point you just made, I said, and this guy, Rabbi, was fired after using the F word in front of the Pope, and everybody laughed. And then a guy gets up as the last question. He's at the very back of the room. He raises his hand. He said, "Carl, I have one last thing I wanted to say. A comment more than a question." He goes, "I'm Steve Rabinowitz, and you have some of the facts wrong." And the whole room got quiet, and everybody turns like that old E.F. Cutton commercial. Everybody turns to look at me. I said, "Rabbi, I'm looking in these Klieg lights." He said, "Yeah, it's me, Carl. How are you?" I hadn't seen him in years. I said, "Well, go ahead. What I have wrong?" He said, "Well, I didn't use the word fuck. I used the word shit, and it wasn't in front of the Pope. It was in front of some of the cardinals traveling with the Pope. And I wasn't fired. I was only suspended for 2 weeks." And then everybody turned to look at me like aghast. And I said, "Oh my gosh, Steve, I'm mortified. I will never say that again. I am so apologetic." I could see he was telling the truth and he knew that. And then he laughed and he goes, "You know what? I like the way you tell the stories better. I sometimes tell it that way myself." And the whole crowd laughed.
Before we run out of time here, we have to talk about one other thing.
Yeah, do.
When people think of presidents swearing, people of my age go back to expletives deleted.
Oh, Nixon. George, I learned something from you in this story. Yeah, go ahead with this. This is good.
Yeah, and all of us from all those expletives deleted that were in there.
This was on the Nixon tapes.
Right.
Yeah. Richard Nixon's tapes, and we thought he was using the most vulgar terms.
Right. And it turns out almost all of them were just hell or damn. And if Nixon had not had those, deleted, he would have looked much better. And I talked to one of his longtime aides, Ken Kajikian, who said, in all my years, 20 years with him, I never heard him use the F word. Never once.
Well, George, that sums it up nicely. You and I are of an age where we never thought we'd cover a president who made Richard Nixon look good. But then Donald J. Trump, the gift who keeps on giving. That'll do it for us for this segment. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, Real Clear Politics. You're listening to George Connon, White House correspondent for National Journal. Thanks for being with us, George.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by presidential historian Tevi Troy. He's the author of The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and titans of industry, as well as several other books. Tevi, welcome back to the program.
Andy, thanks for having me on. I always enjoy the program.
Yeah, well, great. So, Tevi, you wrote a really lovely appreciation of our mutual friend, Ben Wattenberg, who passed away 10 years ago. On June 28th, 2015, he was an author, a pundit, a television host. What should people know and remember about Ben?
Well, first of all, he died too soon. It was indeed 10 years ago this week that he died, and we still miss him to this day. But, as you know, Andy, I like to write obituaries of conservative heroes, people who really helped contribute to this country. And so I thought Ben deserved a little more appreciation and recognition. I don't want him to be forgotten just because it's been last too long since he passed. He was an LBJ speechwriter. He grew up in the Bronx, went to Hobart, served this great country in the Air Force. And then after being a speechwriter, he became a real power, a force within the Democratic Party, always pushing for the party to recognize the moderate voters, trying to keep the party sane, grounded, and trying to fight against the depredations of the left, a fight that the Democrats are still having today. He would have been appalled at Mamdani's win in New York and what it says for the party. But he wrote some really serious books about demography, about the case for optimism, about why the good news is always the good news is the bad news is always wrong, and about values. And he just loved this great country. And he shared so much of his knowledge and his data and his understanding to try and make this a better place.
Yeah. And how did you know Ben?
I first met Ben when I went for an interview to work as his research assistant at the American Enterprise Institute in 1989. I brought with me a letter I had published in the New Republic, which was my first thing published in a national publication. And he liked the letter and he said, I think we can make this work. And so he gave me a very low-paid job as his research assistant, and we bonded and got close. I learned about playing tennis from him, and I'm still playing tennis to this day, but he always was going out playing tennis, taking tennis lessons, playing tennis with Donna Shalala, the former HHS secretary, and Norm Ornstein, the pundit. And I worked on his column. He had a weekly column that came out. I worked on his books, including The First Universal Nation. And I really got an understanding from him about how important data is. All kinds of people bloviate and say this or that, but he actually looked at the data, and this was before the internet. It was before you could just Google anything. He would go into census reports and the National Center for Health Statistics reports, and he would look at what was happening, and he would explain it in plain English. In English, as Gene Kirkpatrick said, Ben knows how to talk American. And he would explain all this stuff in plain English to the American people so they understand the trends of what's really happening in this country.
Yeah. Well, I met Ben, as you know. I was producing a television show in Washington called American Interests. It was on U.S. foreign policy. He was one of the guests. We had guests all the time. And about maybe a year after I left that job, he called me up, and we went into the McDonald's on K Street. I don't know if people remember. Oh, no, I was on M Street, rather. It was right next to 2030 M Street, which was, that was where CBS was at the time. And he said, hey, I want to put on a show. And he laid out, the show was called Think Tank. He had the name all set, and I wanted to do it weekly for public television. And we did. And we launched that in, I had to go back and look. We launched it in 1994. It ran to 2010, so a good long run for television. And every week there was, it was Ben and a group of people, and the idea of the show was to have think tankers on, and academics and authors, and no politicians, no journalists. That was sort of the...
No kidding, remember? That was the third part of the rule.
Right, that was Ben's rule. No journalists, no politicians, no kidding. And we had remarkable people on the program. And I always remember we had Lonnie Guinier and Judge Robert Bork on a panel once together. And that was sort of what we were aiming for, was to really have people with different views come together and discuss in a serious way the issues of the day. And Ben was a remarkable moderator for that. He called himself the immoderator because he always would offer his own opinion. But I learned so much from him and enjoyed him so much over the years. Tell me, one thing about Ben is he was a proud neoconservative. He owned that label proudly, even at the time when people were starting to criticize it. So tell me about that. What was neoconservatism to Ben, and why did he feel so strongly about it?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because, as our friend Jonah Goldberg, who also worked for Ben, used to say that today neoconservative means bagel snarfing warmonger. It's a slur on people that say they're Jews and they're trying to create war everywhere. But the truth is, neoconservatives were people who were liberals who saw that democratic policies weren't working, and they used social science and data to show why the policies weren't working and tried to correct it. Now, the liberals didn't like this and they didn't like being corrected, so they dismissively, and this, the name neoconservative came from Michael Harrington, they dismissively called them neoconservatives, as if to say, well, you're not really part of the liberal family anymore. But Ben embraced that. He liked the fact that he wasn't kind of a country club conservative, but he was this neoconservative, this person who was willing to look at data, look at the numbers, see what was working and what wasn't, and suggest alternate policies, better policies based on real information as opposed to just your ideological priors.
Yeah, the New York Times reviewed one of his books or one of his shows. I can't remember, but the quote was, Wattenberg has the annoying habit of being right, which I think sort of sums it up. I should say this too. This is just something people might not know, but his sister was the actor Rebecca Shull, who very famous for her. She was the woman on Wings, and
the wacky woman on Wings.
The wacky woman on Wings, and she used to come around every now and then. We used to see her, but it was a remarkable family and a remarkable upbringing, really. The Richard Scammon was his partner in writing This USA and The Real Majority, which were really two of his books, which really, as you said in your appreciation, which you can find it on RealClearPolitics, by the way. It's a great piece. Really did sort of dig into the data and use the data to sort of illustrate America. And it did two things, which I think were interesting. One is it sort of painted a positive image of America to a large extent, but it also was sort of a novel way of approaching journalism, was to really sort of dig into data and use it. And he sort of was in some ways among the first sort of data journalists. It's something we seem to have a lot of now, but Ben was really a pioneer in that regard as well.
Yeah, Ezra Klein would hate it, but he owes a debt to Ben.
Right.
Yeah, it's true. Ben really understood the numbers. I think Scammon was very helpful in getting him to understand the numbers, but
Yeah.
Scammon couldn't write with the verve and the zest that Ben did. Ben brought a real electricity to his writing. He loved alliteration, he loved puns, he loved exclamation points, and so he had a very distinctive writing style that was hard to replicate. But it was grounded in numbers. It wasn't just him talking and just opining. It was him saying, "Here are the numbers. The numbers prove a point." And you need to listen to the numbers. You can't just say, well, I disagree with that. You have to say why, and you have to be able to counter the numbers that he was throwing at you. And he knew the numbers better than you did.
Yeah. And one of the things he wrote about, and he coined the phrase, the birth dearth, that's total Wattenberg.
Yeah.
Looking at sort of what we're all talking about now, which is the declining fertility rates and what that would mean for civilization largely. He was a pro-natalist. I think it's fair to say he believed in grandchildren. Another phrase he came up with was the grandchild gap, was sort of his way of looking at that. And there was a sort of
titles, alliteration. I mean, these things were catchy. You remembered what he said because he had a great way of saying it.
Yeah. And he also worked with presidents quite closely and affected a bunch of them. I mean, LBJ, he was a speechwriter for, but certainly Ronald Reagan, I think, called him my favorite Democrat at one point. And Bill Clinton, as you recall, had this sort of briefly famous phone call with him about his book, Values Matter Most. I think it was Values Matter Most, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. Because Ben kind of captured what Clinton was trying to do by bringing the Democratic Party back to the middle. Ben was thrilled with this whole DLC, Democratic Leadership Council, the Progressive Policy Institute. Now, he didn't love everything Clinton did in the end, but he sure was happy that Clinton was trying to moderate the Democrats.
Yeah. Well, Tevi, it's great to have you on the show. I've been talking to Tevi Troy, presidential historian, friend of the show, and the author of a really nice appreciation of our old friend Ben Wattenberg, who passed away just a decade ago, but is worth remembering. And Tevi, I really want to thank you for the piece and for coming on the show and sharing this with us.
Thanks as always for having me. And everybody this weekend should raise a glass to the great Ben Wattenberg.
Well, I will do that too. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Allworth. That's our program for today. We'll be back here tomorrow. Have a great evening.